Wyoming Territory, 1873. The wind cut sharp across the plains as the church doors swung open and Laurel Kingsley was left standing alone under a sky too wide for comfort. The wedding guests whispered behind gloved hands. The preacher cleared his throat. Her bouquet of wildflowers trembled in her grip. And Jeb Taylor, the merchant's son she had been promised to since her 16th year, walked away down the steps with his mother hissing in his ear and disgust on his face. "She looks like a spotted cow, Mrs." Taylor had said just loud enough for Laurel to hear. No man wants to wake up next to that every morning. Laurel stood still. Her freckles burned hotter than the sun overhead. They had always been there, scattered across her cheeks, her nose, her arms. Her mother used to call them angel kisses before she died of fever when Laurel was just 15. But now, at 21, in her wedding dress with the lace collar her sister stitched by hand, they were nothing but a curse. No one stepped forward. No one offered comfort. Her father was long gone, killed in a cattle raid near the North Platte River 3 years back, and her aunt who raised her sat stiff in the pew, refusing to meet her eyes. Laurel turned and walked down the steps alone. The wind lifted her veil and tangled it around her shoulders. Her boots scuffed the dust. By the time she reached the horse tied out front, her hands were shaking so bad she could hardly untie the reins. "Need a hand?" a voice asked behind her. She froze, then turned. The man who stepped forward was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sun-darkened face and steady gray eyes. A workingman. His hat was low over his brow and his shirt sleeves were rolled halfway up his arms. Dust clung to his boots and sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. Not a guest. Not from town. "I do not take charity," Laurel said, her voice flat. "Not offering it," he said simply. "Just saw a woman about to ride off in a wedding dress looking like she might fall over from heartbreak." She blinked against the tears pressing hard. "I am fine." "You are not," he said. "But I reckon you will be." She looked at him, confused. "Who are you?" "Colt O'Rourke," he said. "I work cattle out near the Laramie River, just rode in for supplies. Was not planning on witnessing a heartbreak. Laurel Kingsley." He tipped his hat. "Pleasure." She looked down at the ground, then back up at him, her voice trembling. "He left because of my freckles." Colt's brow lifted. He stepped closer, slow and sure. "Well then, he is a damn fool," her breath caught. He reached up gentle, no rush, and traced the air near her cheek, not touching her, just looking. "They look like stars scattered across your skin, like constellations. Makes a man want to learn every one of them." The words hit her like a warm wind. Her throat closed. No one had ever spoken of her like that. She swallowed. "You are a stranger." "I am," he said, "but I know what I see, and I see someone worth more than that boy ever deserved." She should have turned away. She should have said thank you and gone on home and cried like a proper rejected bride. But something in Colt's voice, low and even like a river in the dark, made her stay. "I cannot go back home," she whispered. "Then do not," he said. "Come with me. I am headed west anyway. You can ride with me to the next town. Get yourself a fresh start." Laurel looked down at her dress, the hem already dusty, and then up at him again. "I do not even know you." "You will," Colt said, and held out his hand. She hesitated only a moment before reaching for it. They rode out of town together, side by side, the wedding dress tucked beneath her saddle, the veil gone to the wind. By nightfall, they had made camp near a quiet bend in the river. Colt built the fire while Laurel changed into a borrowed shirt from his saddlebag and her old riding skirt she kept tied behind her saddle. They ate beans and bread and drank from the canteen. Laurel sat close to the flames, her hands wrapped around the tin cup for warmth. "You ever been out this way before?" Colt asked. She shook her head. "I spent most my life in that town, never gone past the hills." "Well," he said, "you are past them now." She looked up at him. "Why are you being kind to me?" He met her eyes. "Because you deserve it." The night air grew cooler. He handed her a blanket and laid his bedroll a few feet away. Neither of them said much after that, but when she lay down and stared at the stars overhead, she thought about what he said, about her freckles, about stars. She touched her cheek, just below her eye, and for the first time in years she smiled. The next morning, Colt saddled the horses without a word. Laurel rolled up her blanket and helped pack the supplies. "You still want to come with me?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Good," he said. "There is a place I know. Small ranch west of Fort Laramie. A widow runs it. She rents out a bunkhouse for travelers. We can stop there." They rode most of the day in easy silence. The land stretched wide around them, golden grass, scattered trees, the sky endless above. At a creek, they stopped to rest. Laurel knelt at the edge to wash her face. Colt crouched beside her, filling the canteen. "You always ride alone?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "I had a brother once, died in the war. Since then, it has been just me." "I lost my mother young," she said. "Then my father. There is no one left." Colt looked over at her. "You are not alone now." She met his eyes and her breath caught again. They reached the ranch by sundown. The widow, a tough woman named Eleanor, gave them each a place to sleep and a warm meal. Laurel helped with the dishes. Colt offered to chop firewood in exchange for the lodging. That night, as Laurel settled into her cot, she heard Colt outside, still splitting wood. The sound was steady, rhythmic. She lay back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in her life, she was not trying to be what someone else wanted her to be. She was just herself. And somehow that was enough for him. She drifted off to sleep with the sound of his axe echoing in the dark, and the promise of something new rising quietly in her chest. Laurel awoke to the smell of fresh bread baking somewhere close, and the unfamiliar hush of a place not shaped by gossip or pity. The bunkhouse walls were rough-hewn pine, and the thin morning light filtered through the chinks between the boards, soft and golden. She sat up slowly, the wool blanket falling away from her shoulders, and for a moment she simply listened to birdsong, to the creak of a wagon wheel in the distance, to the faint scrape of Colt's voice outside. She dressed in the same skirt from the ride, brushed her hair with her fingers, and stepped out into the yard. Colt stood near the corral, talking quiet with the widow Eleanor, one hand resting on the saddle horn of his gelding. He turned when he heard Laurel's steps on the packed dirt and tipped his hat, his eyes unreadable in the morning light. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "Well enough," she said, her voice rasped and low. "I didn't expect the quiet to feel so loud." Eleanor glanced between them, then handed Laurel a worn apron. "You want to earn your keep here. I could use help churning butter before sun gets too high." Laurel nodded and followed her toward the back porch, where a churn waited beside the door. The morning passed in steady rhythm, turning the handle, wiping sweat from her brow, and listening to Eleanor talk about the price of hay and how the hens had stopped laying since the early frost. By midday, Colt had offered to mend a broken fence along the east pasture. Laurel watched him from a distance while she hung laundry to dry. He worked with quiet focus, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the muscles in his forearms taut with effort. He moved like someone used to being depended on, someone who found purpose in tending what others might miss. Later, while Eleanor napped in the rocker with her knitting half finished in her lap, Laurel wandered toward the creek just beyond the cottonwoods. She knelt by the water, dipping her fingers in to cool her skin, and didn't hear Colt approach until he spoke. "You always walk that soft." She turned her head, startled but not afraid. "I wasn't trying to sneak." "No," he said, "but you've got a quiet way about you, like you're listening to things most folks forget to notice." Laurel pulled her hand from the water and sat back on her heels. I suppose when people don't want to hear you, you get good at hearing everything else. He crouched beside her, resting his arms on his knees. That what it was like, back in that town. I was tolerated, she said, not cherished. Most days I felt like I was apologizing for things I couldn't change. Colt didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he watched the water move around the stones and let her words settle. My brother used to say there's two kinds of lonely, he said at last. The kind where no one's around and the kind where you're surrounded and still hollow inside. Laurel drew her knees to her chest. I know which one I'd choose. He looked at her then, not with pity or caution, but with something steadier. You don't have to stay in either. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. That evening, after supper, Eleanor handed Colt a small tin and nodded toward Laurel. She could use a ride tomorrow. You know the trading post near Cottonwood Creek? I do, he said, glancing toward Laurel. You needing supplies? I need stitching thread, she said, folding her hands in her lap. And I'd like to see what the world looks like past the next bend. They left at first light, sharing the saddle bags between them. The ride was quiet at first, but not uncomfortable. The trail passed through stands of aspen and open stretches of wild grass. A hawk circled above, and the air smelled of warmed sage and horse sweat. Did you always want to be a rancher? Laurel asked after a while. I didn't plan much, Colt said. After the war, I just kept riding west. Put my back into the work that needed doing. The land doesn't lie to you. If you tend it right, it gives back. I've never worked land, she said. I sewed, helped at the general store, kept house, but nothing that left calluses. He smiled, faint and real. Calluses come easy. It's the rest that takes time. They reached the trading post near noon. Laurel bartered for thread and a pair of worn gloves. Colt picked up a length of rope and some nails. Before they left, the storekeeper handed them a paper cone of dried cherries, and Colt split them between their palms as they rode. The sun was lower when they reached a narrow rise overlooking the valley. Colt pulled his horse to a stop and gestured ahead. Laurel, he said, look there. She followed his gaze. Below them the land spread wide and golden, the river winding like ribbon, and beyond it a range of blue-gray hills softened by haze. I've never seen anything like it, she whispered. You have now. She turned toward him. How do you keep from feeling small out here? He looked out across the hills. I don't try. Some things are meant to make us feel small. Doesn't mean we're not part of them. She let that settle in her chest, and for the first time, the bigness of the land didn't feel like something pressing her down. It felt like space enough to start again. They rode the last miles in companionable quiet. When they reached the ranch, the sky had turned the color of ripe peaches, and the air was thick with the promise of rain. That night, Laurel stood on the porch and watched the first drops fall. Colt joined her a moment later, his hat in one hand. You ever think about staying put? She asked. I think about what makes a place feel worth staying for. She turned to him. And what is that? He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her long and careful before saying, someone who sees you not just what you're expected to be. The rain deepened, drumming soft on the roof. Laurel stepped closer without thinking, the space between them narrowing like breath drawn in. I see you, she said. And he nodded, once slow and sure. They stood like that, side by side, while the storm passed overhead and the earth drank deep. The rain lingered through morning, soft and steady, soaking into the earth and leaving the air thick with the scent of wet grass and wood smoke. Laurel rose before first light, her bare feet cold against the plank floor of the bunkhouse. She dressed by lantern glow, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the yard where the sky was just beginning to pale. Eleanor's chickens clucked low from their coop. The horses stood quiet beneath the lean-to, steam rising from warm flanks. Laurel crossed to the shed to fetch kindling, her skirts brushing dew from the tall grass. Colt was already there, sleeves damp from the mist, stacking split cedar along the wall. "You're up early," he said, setting the last piece down. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. "Too much in my head." He straightened and studied her face, then nodded once and handed her a bundle of twigs. Firebox needed filling anyway. Inside the house, they worked side by side without speaking, Laurel tending the flames, Colt measuring oats into the pot. It was a quiet rhythm, one that didn't feel borrowed or strange. Once Alina woke, she sent Laurel out to the pasture with a pail of grain for the mule. The fields were slick with rain, the mud clinging to her boots, but the walk steadied her breath. She found herself watching the way the wind moved through the tall stems, the way the sky opened wider with every step. There was a calmness in it she hadn't known she needed. That afternoon, Alina took Laurel aside while Colt was shoeing a bay mare near the barn. "He's not a man who talks just to fill silence," Alina said, drying her hands on her apron. "If he said something to you, it's because he means it." Laurel met the older woman's eyes. "He hasn't said anything that wasn't true." Alina gave a small nod. "Then you'll do fine." Laurel didn't ask what she meant. She didn't need to. That evening, Colt asked if she wanted to ride out with him to check the fence line that bordered the south ridge. She saddled her mare without hesitation. They rode through the last of the silver light, the horses picking their way along the muddy trail. The sky overhead was pale lavender, the clouds thin and slow-moving. Neither spoke until they reached a rocky rise overlooking the lower pasture. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't been left standing there?" Colt asked, one hand resting easy on his reins. Laurel shook her head. "I don't like to give him that much of my imagining." He chuckled, low in his throat. "Fair." She looked out over the land. "I do wonder what it would have felt like, walking into a life that fit me, not one I had to shrink to fit into." Colt turned his horse slightly to face her. "You don't need to shrink for anything out here." Her fingers tightened slightly on the reins. "I don't know what I am out here. I know how to hem a shirt, how to keep books, how to hold my tongue, but I don't know what I become when none of that's expected." "You become who you were before they told you what you had to be," he said, voice steady. "That's enough." A gust of wind lifted the edge of her shawl. She looked over at him, his face half shadowed by twilight. "Why'd you really offer to take me with you?" she asked. He was quiet a moment. Then, "Because I saw you standing there, and I knew what it was to be left behind with nothing but your pride and the ache in your chest. I'd have wanted someone to ride beside me too." She let the silence stretch between them. "And now, he said, "I'm not just riding beside you, I'm hoping you'll stay." Laurel looked down at her gloved hands, then back at him. "I don't have much." "You've got more than most," he said. "You've got your own mind, you've got grit, and you've got freckles like a night sky." She laughed before she could stop herself. Not a small laugh, but one that caught her by surprise. His eyes crinkled, like the sound pleased him. "I haven't laughed like that in years," she said, her voice softer now. "Feels good, doesn't it?" She nodded. They rode back slower, the horses relaxed beneath them. At the barn, Colt dismounted and reached for her reins. "Let me," he said, helping her down. Their hands brushed, and she didn't step away. Instead, she looked up at him, the lantern glow from the barn door catching the line of his jaw. "I didn't think I'd feel wanted again," she said. "You weren't just wanted," he said. "You were chosen." "There's a difference." Laurel leaned into him then, just enough for her forehead to rest against his chest. He didn't move, just let her be there, his hand resting lightly at her back. Neither spoke. The moment didn't ask for words. When she finally pulled back, she looked at him and said, "I want to stay." His face didn't change much, but she saw the shift in his eyes, saw how something eased there. "Then stay," he said. "We'll figure the rest together." The barn door creaked in the wind behind them. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once and fell silent. Laurel turned toward the house, and this time Colt walked beside her, his hand brushing hers, steady and close. The days folded into one another with the slow, sure rhythm of a life not borrowed, but quietly built. Laurel found herself waking before the rooster, her hands already reaching for work mending a torn feed sack, measuring jars for preserves, scrubbing the grit from a pair of work gloves left by the door. Not because anyone expected it, but because it steadied her. Colt had started clearing a small patch of land on the western edge of the property, not far from where the cottonwoods began to thin into open prairie. When Laurel asked what for, he only said, "Something useful," and handed her a shovel. She worked beside him without needing to ask again. One afternoon, while they dug out stones from the hard, packed earth, Colt leaned on his spade and said, "You ever plant anything before?" Laurel brushed hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Wildflowers in a window box once. They didn't take. Too much shade." He nodded toward the open ground. "Won't be a problem here. Sun's got nothing in its way." She glanced at the horizon. "Seems like a good place for something to grow." He didn't say anything more, just dug deeper, slower. Laurel followed suit. That evening, while Alina counted out dried beans for a stew, she paused and turned to Laurel. "I've seen that look before," she said, not unkindly. "What look?" Laurel asked, folding the edges of a cloth over the bread she'd just pulled from the oven. "The kind that settles in when a girl realizes she's not passing through anymore." Laurel set the bread down carefully. "I don't know what I'm becoming here." Alina tilted her head. "You don't have to know. Just keep choosing it." A few days later, when the fence along the north boundary gave in to the wind, Colt asked Laurel to ride with him to fetch more rails from a homestead a few miles off. They left before noon, Laurel's mare growing steadier under her, the trail familiar now, though it curved through land she hadn't seen before. As they rode, Colt asked, "What did you want before any of it?" "Before you were promised to someone who didn't know what he was holding," Laurel hesitated, eyes on the trail. "I used to imagine running a small mercantile. Nothing large. Just a place where folks could come in from the sun, sit a spell, maybe hear what's going on in the next town over." She gave a quiet laugh. "I wanted to be the one behind the counter, not just passing through it with a list." Colt looked over at her. "That storekeeper in Cottonwood Creek's getting on. Said he'd sell if the right person came along." Laurel blinked at him. "You asked," he shrugged. "Figured it might come up." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. When they reached the homestead, Colt traded a length of chain and a bag of oats for the rails. Laurel helped load them without being asked. The homesteader's wife handed her a jar of gooseberry preserves wrapped in cloth. "For your help," the woman said. "You've got a good way about you." On the ride back, Laurel held the jar in her lap and watched the land slip past in streaks of gold and sage. The wind carried the scent of pine sap and cooling dirt. "Did you ever think you'd want someone beside you for the long haul?" she asked suddenly. Colt didn't look at her right away. "I figured I'd ride alone until something stopped me. Didn't think it'd be a woman in lace standing alone with fire in her eyes." She smiled, just barely. "You stopped." "I did." They didn't speak the rest of the way. But when they returned, Colt unloaded the rails and didn't ride back out afterward. Instead, he helped Laurel set the preserves in the pantry, and when their fingers touched, neither of them pulled away. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the fire crackled low, Colt stood by the hearth, hands in his pockets. "Laurel," he said, his voice quieter than usual, I've got a cabin a few miles east near the Split Rock, small place. Needs fixing." She looked up from darning a sock. "I was thinking," he continued, "maybe it's time I stopped fixing it for just myself." She folded the sock in her lap. "You asking if I'd come with you, I'm asking if you'd stay." She stood slowly, the lantern light catching the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the ones no mirror in town ever let her forget. "I already did," she said. He stepped toward her, close enough that the space between them felt like something sacred. "You sure?" She reached up, laid her palm against the side of his neck, warm and steady. "I'm not afraid of being seen anymore." Colt cupped her waist, his thumb brushing the fabric of her dress as if memorizing the moment. Neither of them kissed, not yet. The fire was enough. The promise was already spoken. Outside, the wind settled. The world around them quieted as if listening. And in the steady hush between heartbeats, something whole took root. The last frost broke in late April, and the soil softened under Colt's boots as he laid the final fence rail along the western plot. Laurel knelt nearby, pressing seeds into shallow furrows with careful fingers. The breeze carried the scent of turned dirt, and the faint sweetness of plum blossoms from the tree Alina had planted years ago. Laurel tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and sat back on her heels. "I never thought I'd plant anything that might outlive me," she said, brushing soil from her palms. Colt leaned on the shovel. "You're putting down roots." She nodded. "Feels like the land's letting me." They worked until the sun slipped low, then rode into town the next morning with a purpose neither of them said aloud. Colt tied the horses outside the chapel just before the noon bell. Laurel stood near the doorway, worn gloves in hand, watching dust drift in the sunlight that filtered through the windows. Inside, the air smelled of old pine and beeswax. The preacher, a quiet man with a limp from a fall off a ladder the winter before, looked from Colt to Laurel and gave a single slow nod. "You'll want it simple?" he asked. Laurel looked at Colt. "Simple's always been enough." They spoke their vows with hands clasped, no guests but the wind whistling through the open door. Colt's voice was low but even. Laurel's didn't shake. When the preacher finished, Colt reached for her hand, not with ceremony, but with the quiet steadiness that had marked every step since she'd left that town behind. They stayed that night in a small room above the mercantile, one the storekeeper offered after locking up. The window overlooked the street and the field beyond, where dusk settled over the tall grass like a shawl. Laurel sat cross-legged on the bed, unpinning her hair. Colt leaned against the doorframe, boots still on, watching her. "You ever regret not turning back when I offered you a ride?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder. "What's there to regret in being seen clearly?" He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, resting a hand over hers. "You still surprise me." "How?" "I thought I was done looking for anything lasting." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "Then it found you anyway." In the morning, they rode back to the ranch with the sun rising behind them. Alina met them on the porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowing at the sight of Laurel's ring. "Well," she said, "about time you two stopped circling each other like half-broke colts." Laurel laughed, and Colt only shook his head with a quiet grin. The weeks that followed were full with small labors and long evenings. Laurel took over the books at the ranch, organizing receipts and ordering feed in advance. She taught Alina how to dry herbs for tea, and in return, learned to pickle onions and salt pork. On warm afternoons, Colt would take her riding past the ridge, pointing out tracks in the dust: elk, fox, even a stray coyote that had lingered too long near the henhouse. One evening, while they shelled peas by lantern light, Laurel looked up from her lap. "There's a parcel of land past the creek," she said. "Flat, good soil. I think we could build there." Colt finished tying the bundle of dried beans and set it aside. "You want a house of your own." "I want a home that starts with us," she said. "Not one borrowed from someone else's past." He studied her a moment. "Then let's build it." They cleared the land together. Elinor lent her hammer, and the storekeeper sent up nails and hinges in trade for preserves. By early summer, the walls stood straight and strong, the roof shingled with cedar. Laurel painted the door pale blue on a whim, and Colt didn't argue. The day they moved in, Colt carried her over the threshold without a word. He set her down inside, where the air still smelled of sawdust and fresh lime wash, and pulled her close. "This feels like starting over," he said. She laid a hand over the place where his shirt stretched tight across his chest. "No. It feels like picking up where we were always meant to begin." Years passed in seasons, marked by harvests and thaw, by the first calf born at dawn and the last frost that killed the lilacs too early. Laurel opened the mercantile in town the following spring, her name painted by Colt's own hand across the front window. She stocked thread, flour, coffee beans, and kept a ledger as neat as any bank's. The women came to her not just for goods, but for talk, for kindness that didn't come with judgment. She offered that freely. Colt rode fence, traded cattle with neighbors, and spent his evenings fixing what needed fixing at home. He built Laurel a shelf for her books and carved a cradle the year they found out she was carrying. Their son was born in late autumn, with eyes the color of wheat and a cry that filled every room. They named him after Colt's brother, though neither of them spoke the name aloud until the moment they saw him, under the same sky where she'd once stood alone in a wedding dress turned to shame. Laurel now rocked her child in her arms, her husband's hand resting warm and sure on her back. The air was cool, the fire steady. And in that room, in that house they had built with their own hands, the world felt wide enough for anything true to last. They never needed to say they loved each other. They showed it in the way Laurel laid out Colt's tools before the sun came up, in the way he always left the porch light burning when she worked late in town. In the quiet, steady way they reached for one another at day's end, when the land grew still and the stars came out, bright and familiar as Freckles.